Hi, I'm Peter Rowlett.
And I'm Katie Steckles. And Peter, what's today's mathematical object?
Well, I have this nice Noughts and Crosses board. Now, Noughts and Crosses is not a game that needs a physical object. However, you can just draw some lines on a bit of paper. But I found this nice wooden Noughts and Crosses set in a charity shop.
Like it's got little rotatey bits.
Yeah, it's got little triangular prisms, I guess.
Yeah.
And one side is a nought, the other side across, the other side is a blank, so that you can turn it around. And actually, this is really good for me because I have a 3-year-old who's suddenly discovered what Noughts and Crosses is, but isn't very confident at drawing. So it's quite nice that we can play the game quickly without having to draw X's and things. Anyway, so I thought there's an opportunity to talk about Noughts and Crosses. Presumably people know this game, but it's a grid of 9 squares, and you put a nought or a cross depending on your which player you are, and it's the first to get through in a line of your symbol wins. I should say that if you're in some parts of the world, it's called Tic Tac Toe, and because certainly that's America, I don't know if it's anywhere else. Therefore, the internet prefers Tic Tac Toe to Noughts and Crosses in general. Anyway, so a few interesting things about this. Because each square has 3 possible positions, which is blank, nought or cross, there are 3 to the 9, which is 19,683 possible ways to fill this grid in. However, that is not the number of possible games.
No, because one of those is all X's.
One of those is all X's, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the ones that are unbalanced like that, more than one apart, are not an actual game in play. And the other thing is that if it's like a row of X's and a row of noughts underneath it, that wouldn't happen, because once one of you is won, you just stop. And then the other one is symmetries. A way to think about symmetries is on a Noughts and Crosses grid, there are only 3 starting positions, because you can play in the middle, or you can play in a corner. If you play in a corner, you can play in any of those corners just by turning the board, or you can play in the middle of a side, and again, the middle of the sides are all equivalent by symmetry. So looking at a square of 9 spaces and saying there are only 3 moves you can make seems a bit counterintuitive, but that's where that comes from. And the same can be applied to games in progress. The whole game can just be rotated, and that doesn't make it a different game fundamentally. So one thing I could talk about is how you solve Noughts and Crosses. Noughts and Crosses is a solved game. What that means is if both players play optimally, it'll always lead to a draw.
Or a win?
No,
I guess
draw.
if both players play
optimally, yeah. If you win, it's because the other person's made a mistake, basically. Yeah, and conversely, if you lose. And a way of sorting this out is an algorithm called Minimax, which is sort of interesting, I think. So in Minimax, what you do is you take a game in its current position, wherever it is, and say there are 4 spaces still left where you could make your next move. You then draw 4 grids underneath that, which are each of those filled in turn. And then each of those will have 3 possible spaces left. So under each of those you draw 3, and under each of those you draw 2, and under each of those you draw 1. And that gets you down to the bottom of having a full grid. Once you get to the bottom row, and you're on a full grid, you then score each of the games. And basically you give them a score of 1 if you're the winner, a score of 0 if it's a draw, and a score of -1 if your opponent is the winner. And you can scale that by n. Quite a lot of stuff you see online has you scoring them as 10, -10 and 0. It's equivalent. I see no point. And then what you do is you work your way back from the bottom of the tree back up to the current position. And on the rows where it's your turn, you choose the maximum of the available options, because you're going to try and win. And on the rows where it's your opponent's turn, you choose the minimum of the possible options, because your opponent is going to try and win. And that gives you a score for each of the rungs on this game tree, each of the branches, I suppose. And then when you get back to the current position, you can then find out what you should do. And if you do that for the starting position with nothing filled in, the starting position is a draw, basically. Right. So what's quite interesting about that is there are ways where you think, oh, well, if I get down this branch here, I can win. But what you've got to remember is that the branch before required your opponent to do something to put you in a position where you could win. And actually at that point they could have chosen to win, and they will definitely do that. So it's an algorithm that takes account of the different players having different priorities, I suppose. And what I quite like about it is it's a completely dumb algorithm, in that it doesn't really know anything. All it knows is what are the available moves I can make, and what does a win look like. and it doesn't know anything about how to play the game otherwise. But using just those 2 bits of information, it can fill out all the possible moves, score them all, and then work out which ones you can actually reach based on your opponent playing optimally, and then win the game. And I sort of said to my students, I put up a partially complete Noughts and Crosses grid, and we enumerated this thing. And I said, it might be obvious to you, it is obvious to me how I could win this grid in this state. Fine. But if you think it's obvious how to win this 3x3 grid, well, what if I made it a 4x4 grid, or a 20x20 grid, or a 3x3x3x3 4-dimensional grid? You know, however you think is straightforward, I can make it much more cognitively difficult for you to make that determination. And the algorithm can still solve it, because it's completely dumb, and it just plods through every possible option. And that's given sufficient computing ability.
Yeah. Well, this just reminds me very much of the Noughts and Crosses Matchboxes thing.
Yes.
So this is I can't remember who it was originally did it, but I think maybe Martin Gardner wrote about it, like all maths.
Yes.
But there was
if it wasn't Euler, it was Martin Gardner. Is that?
Exactly, or Erdős. So sometime in like the 1960s, someone came up with this idea. But more recently, someone we know that writes for Chalk Dust magazine at UCL, Matthew Scroggs, has actually rebuilt this thing. And the idea is that you just have a big pile of matchboxes for each possible state of the game. And as you've described, it's all kind of up to rotations and reflections, so you kind of divide the whole thing down. So you end up with, I think it's like a couple of hundred at the most, matchboxes. And each of them contains coloured beads. And there's some starting setup where all the boxes contain one of each colour of bead or something. You can set it up in lots of different ways, and you can run it in lots of different ways. But the idea is that you play through a game, and at each move you pull out the matchbox that you need to make a decision about that particular state. So you reach a game state, you pick up the matchbox and you open it, and you pick out one bead at random. And that colour will determine which square you then play in. And obviously the only beads that you put in there are the ones that are valid moves from that state. So if there's already an X in one of the boxes, you don't put in the bead for that square. But if at the end of the game you've won, you take all the boxes that were used in that game and you reward whatever the behaviour was that you did. So if you pulled out a blue bead, you put the blue bead back in, but you put an extra 3 blue beads or something like that. So then you put all of those matchboxes back in, and the game, the set of matchboxes doesn't know very much more than it previously did. But if you ended up in that exact same situation again, the probability of it picking those same things is higher because there's more beads of those colours in. And the more you play against it, the cleverer it gets. So it starts off completely neutral. But we did it a couple of years ago for the Science Festival in Manchester. Matt Parker made a video about it, and it was such a brilliant thing because we had people coming up all day, and we basically said, come and play Noughts and Crosses against this pile of matchboxes and it will beat you. And for a while it didn't. For the first half of the day it was kind of stupid, and it essentially just plays at random to start with. So a lot of small children were very happy about how they'd won a thing, but then towards the end of the day, like, we had a graph of the progress of it, and the number of wins just went up and up and up. And we tried different things. So the second day we were there, we tried training it differently, because instead of add 3, I think you take away 1 if it loses, and you don't do anything if it draws. You can reward different things differently. So you can reward draws more favourably, or whatever you want to do. And we did it in a slightly different way the second day, and it didn't learn quite as quickly, so I think it would have needed a lot longer. But on the first day we had a really nice trend. By the end of the day it was basically playing Noughts and Crosses at the level of like a medium-aged child. Like it was reasonably competent at Noughts and Crosses, and it could be anyone who was trying. So it was really nice to see that such a simple idea, and it was nice to have chats with people about machine learning and about, even though we've not told this pile of matchboxes anything, because it's not a thing that's capable of being told anything. We've not explained how Noughts and Crosses works. We've not told it the rules. It doesn't know that 3 X's in a row is a win, but it can still do that. And I guess it's the same idea with the algorithm.
Yeah, I think so. I was going to say this is basically your programming a machine learning algorithm, but using matchboxes rather than code, which is quite nice. So then the other thing is, if you're devastated by the news that Noughts and Crosses is solved, and you've never realised this by playing it, there are variants you could do. So you could just do 4x4 Noughts and Crosses. That's not very interesting. You can do n by n Noughts and Crosses, choose your n, preferably a positive integer. There's a version where you play on an infinite plane and you agree in advance a value for k, and the aim is to get k in a row. Now that's kind of interesting, because Minimax won't work for that, because you can't enumerate every possible option, because there are infinitely many of them, so you have to come up with something else there. You can also go into higher dimensions. 3D noughts and crosses is a slightly strange thing, because what you could do is draw 3 noughts and crosses grids on top of each other and just move in whichever one you want, and remember that if you go in the same square on each, then you're making a vertical row. And if you've got to think about what a diagonal would look like in 3D space.
Yeah.
But if you bought 3D noughts and crosses, you would get a wooden plate or a plastic plate or something with 9 pegs on, and some noughts and crosses that you drop onto these pegs. So then you can only play on the bottom layer, and you can only play on the higher layers once you've already gone in that position on the lower levels. So there's kind of 2 games there, and they just play slightly differently.
Yeah, I think I've seen kits for 3D noughts and crosses that are the proper 3D thing.
Right.
But they almost always consist of 3 flat plates that you can place a bead onto in each of 3 layers.
Star Trek 3D chess style. Yeah, absolutely. And then you can do... So there's quite a nice set of rules that a chap called David Butler came up with for doing 4D noughts and crosses, where you have your 3, one stacked on top of each other, making a cube, but then you have 3 of those pushing out into the 4th dimension, and there are all sorts of lines you can make there. But because it becomes quite easy to make a line of 3, and there are so many possibilities. What he ended up doing was he made it so that a move was placing 3 of your symbol, and the aim was to get a plane.
Right.
But a plane could be any one of the individual layers, but also all sorts of wacky things. Like if you imagine a plane moving diagonally through a 4D cube. So he has this really nice PDF with loads of different. Like for example, if you got the top right position, say, in every one of the 9 grids, that's a plane.
Yeah, in 4D.
In 4D, but there are all sorts when you take diagonals into account.
Yeah, if you heard Peter laughing just then, it was because you could see my face and I was trying to imagine a plane moving diagonally through a 4D cube.
Yes, you sort of screwed up your face and looked like you were going to fall off your chair.
Yeah. That's what the 4th dimension does.
Yeah.
That's the main impact of the 4th dimension in 3D.
And I quite like rule twists. So there are some commercial games. We have a thing called the Maths Arcade at Sheffield Hallam University where I work, which is a sort of optional drop-in thing where we have some games and people come and play games. And there's a game called Quarto. There are a few that are commercial games that are variants on noughts and crosses. I mean, Connect 4 is, right? It also has that gravity constraint. Quarto, Quixo, there's one called Pentago. There are a few games like this that you can look up. But just on a normal pen and paper, you can play noughts and crosses where the first player to make 3 in a row loses.
Yeah.
That's kind of nice. It plays quite differently if you have a go at it. You sort of think, oh, well, that's, but actually when you're playing it, it does feel quite different. You can play what I think gets referred to as wild noughts and crosses, where each player on their turn chooses to play either a nought or a cross, and if you put the 3rd matching symbol in a row down, then you win.
Right.
So you aren't necessarily one of the 2. You just
right.
So if you're the 3rd person to put a nought down in a row, you win, or a cross. So that's quite nice. Yeah,
because in regular noughts and crosses, you're trying to get 2 in a row of your own with a gap at the end, but avoid the other person getting 2 in a row.
Of theirs,
but in that case, you're trying to get no 2s in a row when it's the other person's go.
Yes, and the Quarto is a bit like that, which has 4 attributes, and you're trying to match any of them. And
that's kind of like a Latin square, simultaneous 4 different attributes on the same set of pieces.
Yeah, I guess so. But one of the mistakes people make with Quarto is they get very invested in, that is my line of tall pieces. How dare you win with my line of tall pieces?
And it's not that
it's
at all.
It's the same for that, there's one where you both play crosses, and the first person to make 3 in a row loses or wins, whichever you like, but loses is probably more interesting. And then there's some very weird ones. There's one called Ultimate Noughts and Crosses, or Ultimate Tic Tac Toe.
Oh, is this the 3x3 grid of 3x3 grids?
That's right.
Right.
Yeah. And you're playing on the 3x3 grids inside, but really you're playing on the ultimate grid. So it's a normal noughts and crosses grid, but each square has in it a noughts and crosses grid. And when you win one of the subgrids, you then win that square in the main game.
So, if X wins on one of the grids, that square becomes an X in the big game.
In the big game. Right. But it also has the twist that where you play on the little grid determines which of the subgrids that your opponent has to play on next.
Okay, so if you play in the top middle, the next move has to be in the top middle grid.
Yes. absolutely.
Right.
So then you end up with all sorts of weird things where there's an easy win here, but if I make that easy win, it then sends you somewhere where you're going to make an easy win, where you're going to get 3 in a line. I don't want you to do that. So you end up making... But what's quite nice about that is that it breaks in both the top grid, the big grid, and also the subgrids. It breaks the rule that you're taking turns.
Yeah, because you might get 2 goes in a row on the same grid if
Absolutely.
someone plays.
So the normal rules of... So people who know how to play Noughts and Crosses really well, the same rules don't really apply. And there's also one called Quantum Noughts and Crosses, which you can perhaps look up. But there's a whole... you basically entangle... it's a 3x3 grid, but you pick 2 of them and quantum entangle them. And then at some point they collapse and one of them becomes the nought rather than the other one. But there's a point where those 2 things are entangled.
They're both simultaneously a nought and a cross.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
Or something.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So there's a lot of fun you can have with these games just by varying the rules.
So as a topologist, I've done a fair amount of playing around with Noughts and Crosses by identifying the edges of the regular grid. So if you think of it as a square, identification spaces of a square, so you can wrap it into a cylinder or you can wrap it round into a torus. You can wrap it onto a Mobius band, which is weird because then you're playing it on the one side of the Mobius band all at the same time, which is a bit horrible. And you can then do all the stupid 4D ones like a Klein bottle and a real projective plane and things. And it's interesting because it changes the rules of the game slightly. I think when you get onto a cylinder or a torus, you lose the ability to draw. In the 3x3 case, because there are just so many lines. So the drawn games for normal Noughts and Crosses all contain a winning line for a cylinder game, and things like that. But then once you get to the Mobius band, you've got these different ways to make lines of 3 that are kind of twisted, split across, kind of bottom left, bottom middle, and top right becomes a line of 3 somehow. And the more winning lines you have, it kind of feels like it's easier to win because you have more ways to make a line of 3. So I think there are some ways you can change the game that make it more interesting, but if they make it easier to win, then I don't know if that's worthwhile in terms of whether it makes it a better game or whether it makes it a more boring game because it's much easier to win and whoever goes first has a much higher chance of winning.
I was just looking up that it still exists, but there's a app that I can get on my phone, and maybe you can on yours, by somebody called Jeff Weeks, called Taurus Games, which has Noughts and Crosses on all sorts of different surfaces, but loads of other games as well. So you can play chess on a cylinder and things like this. But that's quite nice because when you're playing the Noughts and Crosses, you can slide it around so you can see more easily that this line follows on from that line. It's a really good way to try and get your head around different geometries.
One of the main difficulties with playing topological Noughts and Crosses games is actually working out what's just happened. And it's quite easy to make a line of 3 and win without noticing that you've done that, and then 3 moves later someone goes, oh no wait, hang on, I won.
Anyway, so jolly good. That was Noughts and Crosses.
Great. Well, I'm at Steckles on Twitter.
I'm at Peter Rowlett on Twitter.
And we both blog at a website called The Aperiodical, which is aperiodical.com.
And if you want to get in touch with us, suggest any objects, if you have any comments or anything like that, you can send an email to objects@aperiodical.com. Thanks for listening. The music is Funk Game Loop by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons.